Hi, I'm Randall Widenar here with GLF, and I'm here with Dr. David Miller from Princeton University. He's a professor there of business ethics. He is also the director of their Faith and Work Initiative, and he's also the president of the Avodah Institute. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Great to be here, Randall.
Now, we're going to be going over the issue, an ethical issue here, specifically the Wells Fargo incident that happened back in 2016, as just sort of a springboard to talk about ethics and how it affects groups of individuals and how we can deal with that and wrestle with that as people of faith. So why don't you tell us, David, about what happened so we can kind of have a backdrop of what happened in this scenario?
Sure. So Wells Fargo is a bank which over the past decade has had really an exceptionally positive image and reputation. Its former CEO, John Stumpf, was on the cover of several magazines as the executive of the year and things of that nature. So to put this in perspective, it's a good reminder that companies with terrific reputations and also excellent financial performance are as susceptible to fall and make mistakes as organizations that don't have good reputations. So I want to put that in context. I have been teaching this. In fact, when this was unfolding, I was teaching a class at Princeton University called Business Ethics and Modern Religious Thought. And every year I try to find one case that will have legs, something that's going on live that will go on during the whole semester so students can sort of follow it and learn to do some robust analysis of a complex ethical case. And every year I wonder, Randall, well, what am I going to do? And somehow the universe always gives me a new case. There's not a shortage of them.
Yeah.
And we playfully called this one the case of 5,300 bad apples, or what went wrong at Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
So what's that about? And for those of you who missed this in the media, there were it was a phenomenon of cross-selling, a very legitimate legal technique where if you have a good relationship with your retail clients in banking, if you have a savings account, well, gosh, since you know them and they've come to hopefully like you, sell them a money market account or sell them a credit card service or a mortgage or whatever. So it's called cross-selling, selling across different product lines. And Wells Fargo become a master of that. The industry average, I can't remember exactly, was something like, for other banks, might be 2.3 products per client. Well, at Wells Fargo, it was almost 5 or 5 point something clients per product. And John Stumpf, in motivating the sales force, said 8 is great. 8 is great. I think they had 11 products total they could cross-sell, and they wanted to get now people up to 8. Extraordinary. So there's huge pressure and pride in being at the head of the industry. Back in 2011, though, there were some smoke signals of problems. The LA Times ran an expose that actually was published in end of 2013, where they were making the sales pressure was, in fact, I think the headline was Wells Fargo pressure cooker sales culture comes at a cost, in which there was a fine levied against them against local regulators. It unfolded later, of course, that that wasn't just an isolated incident as it was portrayed at the time, but ultimately as this began to go public and got to be a board-level issue, that an internal investigation resulted in the firing of 5,300 people who had inappropriately sold, cross-sold. And so here's the key I should have mentioned earlier. It's not just the selling. Selling is fine, but they were creating false accounts. So let's say, Randall, I pretended that you had agreed to a new product, and I opened it on Monday, but I closed it within 24 hours. So I'd get the sales credit and my little bonus for opening your account. You never knew it, and I would lie. I would use your phone number. I would use your personal information, and then I'd close it. So on the surface, you could justify as a sales rep that, hey, I've not really hurt anybody. You know, Randall's fine. And in fact, it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah.
So that sets the stage, maybe, that a number of people fired, and initially the CEO's stance was, it's all bad apples. Everybody else is fine. It was some aberrant behavior.
Okay, so it ended up being 1% of their workforce that was bad apples.
Yeah, and during his testimony, he said, hey, it's just 1%. But you do the math, well, that's a lot of people. And also, I beg to differ. Are they really bad apples? You know, I'm sure a small percentage were, but I suspect most of those 5,300 people were probably terrific folks, no different than you or me or our cousin or our sister or our children or whatever. And but certain environmental, certain intrinsic and extrinsic variables came up which caused otherwise fine people to do things which, in hindsight, and maybe even at the time, they knew they ought not to do.
So that sort of is the big question here. How does that happen in a corporation? How do we can all understand sort of the ethical lapse of the rogue trader that goes
Sure.
off. That's just their fault. But how do large groups of people, we call that groupthink, how does that get created in a corporate culture where there's sort of group permission to do something that normally these normal people wouldn't do?
Right.
How does that start to exist in a corporation?
You know, it's a phenomena. The professor, I believe it was Janice Irving, first wrote a book on this back in the 70s and revised it then in the 80s. But the idea was that collective or cohesive units of people, now frankly, that could be a sports team, it could be people in a church, it could be any number of, it could be military officers, it could be anywhere. But in this case, corporate people who have a cohesive identity start losing independent thought. So hence the phrase groupthink as opposed to independent think. And it prompts people who otherwise might raise their hand and say, hey, you know, something's not right here, or I disagree, or I'm uncomfortable with this. Groupthink pressures people into following a script. You know, think in police forces now and then they talk about the blue wall of silence, the blue uniform of silence, that you don't rat out one of your fellow cops because the world's dangerous out there and you got to stick together. And even if someone frankly did something they shouldn't, in the scheme of things, you got to get rid of the bad guys, and the ends justify the means. So after a while, you can become dulled to your ethical radar can be switched off, and you might even advocate groupthink because you want everyone to be loyal. It's a dangerous world out there. There's a lot of pressure. We got to stick together. So
what are some of the factors that specifically led to that in this Wells Fargo thing? What were some of the factors that you think may have led to this, so that people can maybe, you know, you see the warning signs before they create a culture that has this kind of thinking?
Yeah, but now having said groupthink is a phenomenon, I also don't want to say that was the only problem. A lot of things went on.
Sure.
So it just can take a challenging situation and catapult it to another level of problematics. Because kind of to me, one of the big questions is, what about all the people who, I mean, if you ask me to open up a false account without your permission, I know that's wrong because you disagreed. You said, no, I don't want anything else, but I do it anyway. So people had to know it was wrong. Yeah. So then that begs the question, well, why didn't they? Well, groupthink was one part. If all your buddies are doing it and everyone in the department is doing it, well, then like, okay, say, well, that's the way it's done. That's what I have to do. But you know, what about that first person or the second person or the 10th person or the 100th person before it became sort of a group mentality? One of the biggest things is pressure. That particularly if you're in a quota-driven income job, that your income is dependent upon meeting certain numerical targets of closing X number of sales, whatever the industry sector. In this case, it just happened to be retail banking. Wow, that's a lot of pressure. And it emerges that some of the local bosses, managers in different branches who were doing this were not letting people go home on time. They were threatening them with loss of their job. They weren't paying them overtime, or a variety of things that if you didn't meet your targets, you get fired. Now, at some level, there's nothing illegal with that. If there's a performance plan, you have to meet your performance. But if you have an unreasonable target, that's when the problems start happening. So I think people, number one, is there was huge environmental or workplace pressure. Frankly, fear of losing your job. And people did get fired. Yeah. What also emerges in subsequent investigations is a few early on, some people did raise their hands. So these good apples who did the right thing say, wait, this just doesn't seem right. And most of those people, if not, well, I'll just say many or most of those people got fired. Okay. And we could argue legally they were unlawfully dismissed, but that we'll let the courts figure that out. Yeah. So pressure is one. Another factor is fear. If really often related to pressure. If your boss, if you're, let's say, the sole bread provider for your family, and you are at risk of losing a job, and let's say maybe you're in a small town where there's not a lot of other options. Correct. You know, it's not cricket. You know, it's not kosher, but you say, what the heck? You know, geez, I better do it because I can't risk losing my job. So those are some, it's a mixture of, so the environment, there's some scholars that talk about intrinsic and extrinsic contextual factors. So extrinsic, it's what's being pushed on you, the water you swim, is the water temperature being turned up or turned down. And intrinsic is kind of your own motivations and your own reaction to things. And some are, of course, a hybrid.
So is there a sense of permission giving at some point in time, either by authority or even by peers? You know, how does that happen in a group environment where someone suggests, hey, I did this, and then there's no sort of, hey, that's not right. There's just silence, you know. How does that affect like the individual within a group?
Well, what emerges just as another piece of the fact pattern, and then to come back to your question, is that this was not an isolated thing. Initially, it was portrayed as isolated. And management surely knew about it and should have done something earlier. In fact, it appears that some very high level of management were not only aware, but they were endorsing it. They were running training programs to, I think it was the state of Arizona, that region was like the lowest sales cross-selling per sales rep ratio. And with 1 year, they magically turned it around and were tops in the country. Well, gee, how do you do that? Well, you ought to ask a question, and a good internal audit or a good manager or would have said something. You just can't flip a switch like that. What happened? Well, what happened is they were teaching these people these ways to cheat or game the system to open up these fraudulent accounts and then try to close them quickly. But back to your question. So one of the there's a great article in Harvard Business Review called "Ethical Breakdowns: Why Good People Often Let Bad Things Happen" by Bosserman and Tenbrunsel, and they list 5 different things that they attribute to what causes good people to do things that they know are no longer good. And one is, this is an extrinsic factor. There's what they call well-intentioned but ill-conceived goals. So it's a perfectly good intention to say we want to increase our cross-selling statistics, but if you have outrageously unreachable goals, people will either leave, or they will fail, or they will cheat. And a large number of people, many people did leave, but also many people cheated. So that's a problem. Another, and this is more of a management leadership problem, is what these scholars called motivated blindness. And by that, it means you have a motivation, i.e. you meet your targets, you make millions of dollars of bonuses if you're a senior manager. So you're motivated to turn a blind eye to something you know is wrong. And then there's, of course, we all know the phrase, the slippery slope, where you know the first time you shouldn't have done it, but you cheat a little bit on your expense account, or you speed in the car going above the miles per hour, and well, you don't get caught, and after a while it's like, well, okay, you no longer even have that still quiet voice in your mind saying, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do this. And so after a while, what once you might have found as certainly wrong, if not abhorrent behavior, later you see it as normative behavior, and you might even be willing to go to the mat and justify it, or blame other people. You and I were talking earlier about the Stanley Milgram experiments, those famous ones back in the 1950s up at Yale, and perfectly normal citizens were found to be willing to, under authority figure instructions, be obedient to perform tasks which physically hurt people, administering electric shocks because they didn't answer the questions correctly. And it's only a small step away from that to understand how prison guards can be abusive to prisoners, how Nazis could have had these horrible experiments and things going on.
It was interesting in the Milgram experiments too, that there was a noted difference when there was a compatriot or a peer or someone within that experiment who were saying, no, I'm not going to do that. That gave courage to the other individuals to say, I don't think I'm going to do this either. Because all of them were notably discomforted by the prospect of doing what they were doing, being asked to do.
Exactly. But nonetheless, many of them, not all, went ahead and did it. And that's kind of the extraordinary thing. So we've been focusing a lot on the extrinsic things that cause the conditions for good people to do things, but maybe the flip side, and to me then the interesting question is, well, what do we do about that? Because the reality is all organizations are going to have this go on, even good organizations, like we were saying.
Yeah, like we were interviewing Andy Sigg from Merrill Lynch a couple months ago, and he said that during the financial crisis there was a disconnect between the values on the walls and the values that were being implemented.
Yeah.
And leadership was able to turn that around at Merrill Lynch. But how does that turnaround happen, and how do they detect that disconnect?
Yeah, slowly and with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah.
It's not done with clever slogans and T-shirts and tchotchkes on your desk. There's nothing wrong with those, but they ought to come later. First, the CEO and the executive team and the next level down have to make very clear this is serious and not just a flavor of the month. And there's a lot of ways you could do that. When I work and advise different CEOs about this, I say, every speech you give, every town hall, every interview you give, you've got to make sure that on your top 5 business strategic goals, one of them has to be values and culture. And if you don't talk about it, people are going to assume it was just flavor of the month.
So focus is key.
Focus is key, talking about it, but not just talking, then of course doing it. If go back to Wells Fargo, if you're high-flying regional manager or vice president or executive vice president, whatever level, if they're a great rainmaker, but we find out that their behavior is not aligned with the values, if you don't reprimand or just frankly dismiss that person, everybody's smart. They'll say, well, I see what's on the wall, and I see that so-and-so, Carrie or Tommy or Sally, gee, they didn't get fired for this, so I guess it's not only is it okay, it's expected of me. People aren't stupid.
Partners in leadership, a consulting firm has this below the line. We try to manage towards things like outcomes and actions, but they point out that the real management, the real leadership happens below the line, which is beliefs and experiences. So an experience where a marketer or a manager is allowed to get away with things, that creates an experience that creates a belief in a workforce. And it's those things that really drive the workforce to behave.
Yeah.
So
and kind of going back to what you're saying, if an individual person stands up, it's extraordinary what can happen. And of course, one of two things can happen. They get fired, they get shot, the proverbial shoot the messenger phenomena, or maybe, just maybe, and this does happen, the boss or the person who's trying to get them to do something that's illegal or unethical, they may hear that pushback and stop. Or other people may come along and say, hey, I'm with Randall on this one. I'm just not comfortable doing this. I don't care how much pressure we're on or what, I might lose my job over this, but I'm just not going to do this. I can't picture one of my colleagues calling up my grandmother and opening up a false account in her name, and she's going to have no clue it was done. And then it's going to hurt her credit rating. And like when you personalize the problem, so there is, and I tell my students, being ethical does not always pay in the short run. You need to understand that when you take a moral stand on something, you might pay with your job or missing a promotion or things like that. I mean, that's a hard world out there.
It is.
That said, and this is what we talk about at the Greenwich Leadership Forum is, we ask the question, well, for people of faith, not that they're going to be more or less ethical per se, but what else do they have in their toolkit that maybe not everybody else does? And one of the things in their toolkit is this belief, and at least in the Christian tradition, and certainly in many others, the Jewish tradition, is that, well, God will somehow provide, God will somehow honor you for being ethical and moral. And you might in the short run take a hit, but God will be with you through the whole journey. So you can have sort of a moral courage that, as one of the TV broadcasters used to say at the end of the story, well, we know the end of the story, that it will work out, even though in the short run it could be horrible.
Mm-hmm. So that will give anyone hope, and I think hope is a key component of good leadership, that eventual direction is more noble or hope-worthy than whatever things that we need to construct to get there. So talk a little bit about, obviously 5,300 people were let go, and you were talking about the integrity and the good reputation of the CEO. How much did they know about this? We'll never know. We're not to adjudicate this, but where should a corporation stand up maybe and say, okay, this is our responsibility, and there were people that violated rules, but Yeah. How to handle that? It's very, very tricky.
What is, and there's multiple levels of this really important question, and it's kind of the postmortem. It's like, and hopefully you learn from it. But the reality is, we have to do a postmortem and learn from it. Well, as I understand from public domain information, that an awful lot more was known about what was going on than the CEO, the former CEO John Stumpf, initially led people to believe. He essentially said, whoops, we had a problem. It's terrible. I'm as embarrassed as could be, but we're a fine organization. It was just these 5,300 bad apples. And initially, there was no senior executives lost their job. And then there are a few what I would call middle management people here and there that lost their jobs. Then the board came under scrutiny. Well, wait a minute. If there's an article in the LA Times, how can you come say that nobody told you?
Yeah.
And so that begged the question, what was, and we all know it's an interesting corporate governance challenge, that how much does this, particularly if the CEO is also the chairman, if they haven't split the roles, the CEO can filter what people see and don't see. So should the audit committee have known about this? The risk committee, the comp committee, of course they should have. This was a material event. He was trying to make it sound de minimis, non-material, which says, unfortunately, something about his leadership. Now, that also may mean that maybe he was getting bad information from Carrie Tolstadt, the senior executive who essentially ran all this retail cross-selling business. So was she hiding information from him so he could have plausible deniability, as the saying goes? Or did she tell him and he just trusted that she was going to fix it? We don't know some of that, but surely people knew. And one of the things that I think it should be a given is if you find out something egregious has happened that puts the whole franchise at risk, reputational risk as well as financial risk, that the reality is people need to lose their jobs. They need to be, it's an appropriate action to punish someone for this. This isn't the kind of thing where you close a blind eye or you say, gee, I didn't know about it. People did know about it. And it's unfair that people at the lower end wage scale, whether they're an hourly worker or making hourly wages or just a low salary, that they're the ones, those 5,300 people lose their jobs. What about the people who are making $100,000, $500,000, $750,000 a year, over $1 million a year? Well, don't you think some of them have some responsibility?
Yeah, and in the discussion that we've had, they're the ones that probably bear more responsibility. This probably wasn't a grassroots effort to create this environment. It was something that was created from the top down.
How can you have 5,300 people in over dozens of branches and states, maybe hundreds of branches and dozens of states? How could they somehow collude to say, "Hey guys, here's the scam, here's the deal, here's how we're going to make our numbers"?
Were they tweeting back and forth? Yeah.
Did they have a social media subversive group? Well, of course not. They were being told to do this by somebody, or wink nod told to do it.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't want you to break the rules, but here's something you could do.
Yeah.
So I think it's
there's some
mandatory that you have to find out, and it's painful and it's hard, and it might be some of your best friends you've worked with for 20 years. You've gone through the training program. They're great people. They've got a wonderful family. You go to church or synagogue together, but they're the ones that created the conditions for these 5,300. Now there might be 50 of those 5,300, 100 who are culpable, but now the reality is everyone shouldn't be given a free pass. If you're told to do something illegal,
you bear some responsibility for that.
You have some responsibility too. I understand if it's a very difficult, pressurized situation, so I don't want to cast the first stone.
No.
But they're not void of responsibility, but certainly I would put the higher onus and critique on management at all levels.
Is there a respectable way to sort of engage with this in the workplace? Because not everything that is going to be asked of you is going to be illegal. It could be just disrespectful, or you could be asked to be a workaholic, to show up at more hours than is healthy for your family. How do you speak to that in a mature, healthy way without coming across holier than thou when there's an ethical violation? You just throw up your hands and say that's just wrong. And how do you maintain status and good relationships while also pointing out a difficulty?
Yeah, it's a great question, Randall. In fact, to me, there's sort of two pieces to it. One is discerning when you choose to raise your hand, and then
So
secondly,
not in a shameful
how
way.
you raise your hand, or whether to, because let's face it, the world is very imperfect, and every organization, and every person I know, including myself, is imperfect. So if we were always raising our hand, addressing everything, no one's going to listen to you.
Yeah.
St. Paul talks about being a noisy, clanging gong. Like people just will
Yeah.
tune out. Oh, there's Randall. He's just going on again, and you get ignored. Sorry to pick on you today.
No, that's okay.
So first, you need to figure out which fight you're going to fight, and that is not a small question. If someone tells a racist joke or a sexist joke or something like that, people are at a happy hour somewhere. Well, do you say, no, hey, I'm sorry, that's, do you step in publicly in front of everybody, or do you do it later? You have to pick your fights. So let's say you're being pressurized to do this now, back to the Wells Fargo system. So let's say you choose that's a fight you're going to fight. You're going to pick it. So then how? So whether we've decided, yes, we will. Now the second question, how do you do it in a way that's not obnoxious, holier than thou, sanctimonious, et cetera?
Yeah.
A couple examples. Of course, every context will vary. A friend of mine used to be general counsel for a large data services company that were essentially taking people's sort of data centers over and subcontracting it for them. And they were being asked to bid on a very lucrative, completely legal, highly profitable case to take over a pornography back office. Not to do the filming, but to run
just to run their web server.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, and all that. And actually, it ended up, everyone was a little bit unsure what to do. A lot of revenue pressures that year, and it ended up being a board level decision, which was rather unusual. And it was, and everyone's going around voting finally, and most people were saying, okay, I guess we got to do it. If we don't, someone else will, and it is legal, right? General counsel, yes. And finally, one person stood up, and she said, I just got to say, I'm just not comfortable with this. Is this what we want to be known for?
Yeah.
That's all she said. She didn't go into human sex trafficking. She didn't go into pornography addiction issues. She didn't go into religious critique of it or objectifying of women or none of that. She just said, I'm just not comfortable with it. Is this what we've been known for? So in many situations, just on golly gee, shucks, I'm just not comfortable with this.
Yeah.
That will start a conversation. And then what happened in that room, it may be a little bit like that classic movie, 12 Angry Men. A couple other people might say, well, I'm not so comfortable either.
Yeah.
And maybe it can lead to, I understand the pressure. I know we've got to meet our goals, boss, but can't we find some other way to do it?
So a way to have a respectful, soft startup, it would be a way that Gottman might approach it, where you're not coming in with guns blazing. You're just saying, let's look at this again. Maybe there's a better way. And that gives the other person an opportunity to reposition themselves without feeling shame or completely condemned.
Exactly. And kind of because everyone wants to save face. No one wants to be embarrassed or called out. Now I realize the world isn't always civilized, and that person may shut the heck up and do it as I say, or you're out of here. So not everyone is going to respond well. But I generally would say, let's start gently, respectfully, and say, isn't there another way we could do this? Then another level of conversation gets into, well, you're the boss, and I'll take your orders, but are you? What happens if we get caught? Wow, this is going to kill all of our careers. And again, that may or may not sober someone up to another conversation. So you can kind of have these levels. And then you have to decide as an individual, if each time your boss, your supervisor is telling you, shut up, I don't need to hear all this, then you need to think about, wow, well, if this is a high stakes thing, if it's severe enough, I need to escalate this. Now that has its own challenges, but big organizations, particularly you could maybe go to your boss's boss or go to a mentor or someone, but they may be in cahoots too. That's all good companies, and of course, Wells Fargo would have had one as well. Have a helpline, a sort of an anonymous internal reporting vehicle, and you can at least report there. The final thing you could do, which of course is high stakes, is do an external whistleblow. You can go to the media or a regulator and report it.
So that gets us back around to where we started with GLF. We're talking about how groups affect us, and in group discussions and in permission giving and encouragement. How does a group we all belong to different groups in our world? How does GLF sort of crack that nut a little bit of being able to sort of a unique place between business and church that might be able to cultivate some of these dialogues of what happens in the workplace.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I want to go back to this groupthink. Groupthink cuts both ways. If you have a group which has high standards and high dignity and a high quality behaviors and high creativity and high loyalty, so positive attributes, well, the group can be a healthy ecosystem, a healthy organism, if you will, and it can reject a tissue transplant that's toxic. So let's say you're a new hire. And in fact, I know a story. One of the companies I work with, they did a professional hire. Someone who's a great rainmaker, brought in to solve a skill gap they had. And that person was known as being, as it happens, sexually harassing his assistants or his secretary or whatever. And one of the other existing secretaries said to the secretary who he was abusing, "Hey, you don't have to put up with that. We don't do that here." And sure enough, they did, and the guy got fired. So what GLF, what we'd like to think, we're not perfect for sure, but we'd like to think of ourselves as a healthy groupthink, if you will, that where we can encourage each other and we could tell stories and bring in people like Andy Sig or Bob Dahl or Carla Harris or any number of people, Ann Mulcahy, and where we'll learn from their experiences, and we'll go, I think, I could do that. And I don't even have to be the CEO to do that. I could be wherever I am in my career, and we can get moral encouragement, moral inspiration.
And to see others who have gone the course and have survived, taking the stand. And they come out the other side, and they're still living, and they're still producing well in God's environment, I guess.
And one man put it, I was once trying to decide what to name a course I was teaching, and he said you should, as business ethics and religion, looking at the role of religion as one of our tools in our toolkit to help stay on follow our North Star, so to speak. And he said you should just call it sleeping well at night.
There you go.
So even if worse things happen in your job and you get fired or laid off, at least you can have that feeling of sleeping well at night. That doesn't put bread on the table, but it certainly is very powerful. And over time, again, the scriptures would teach, and the faith traditions, many of them, that the Lord will provide. Somehow you'll come back out.
And that I like the way Viktor Frankl put it. If you pursue goodness and love, the things like monetary gain and that will ensue in life. It's not something that we pursue as our primary goal, but it comes when you are doing things that are well and good in life.
Well, I know I've asked, you may remember the name Bill Pollard now. He's getting on in years, but for decades he was a great public figure and was the chairman and CEO of the Service Master Company. At its peak, it had over 200,000 employees, direct and indirect employees, and it was founded on the company and the principle. The first of 4 corporate goals was honor God in all we do. And I remember once asking Bill, what's your favorite biblical verse? And without skipping a beat, he said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and then all this will be given unto you." And he said, the way I understand it, if I, in my career, if my goal is to get to the top and make a lot of money, not a good goal, because I'm more likely to trip and fall. But if I'm trying to live a good life, an honorable life, a life of ethical probity, a God-pleasing life, if you will, that you do that, and all the other stuff sort of falls in line over time.
That's a good place to leave with that thought, David. So we appreciate your time here and helping us explore this whole world of the corporate ethics and how we affect one another. So
well, thanks for your great questions in these conversations, and we'll keep it going.
All right, lots of fun. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.